Silence in the courtroom. The gavel came down sharply from the judge's hand, sending a cracking sound reverberating off the high wooden walls. It was a loud sound, but it wasn't the noisiest thing in the room. That was the crowd's collective gasp. Their gasp being full of anticipation, curiosity, and disbelief. Kody Brown sat at the defense table. Not the arrogant man viewers used to watch saunter across the TV screen, as the matriarch of a large polygamous family. His shoulders were hunched. His large shoulders weighted down as if the years had finally rested on him at once. His eyes, once arrogant and sure, now were red, puffy and glassy, giving away the turmoil brewing within. In his shaking hands, he held a pile of legal documents. Documents that meant more than just papers. They were his destiny, his reputation, his family's last lifeline. The air was thick with anticipation. Rows of onlookers leaned in, breathing shallow, hearts thudding. Some had come for justice, others for scandal, and some simply to see a man brought low who had once seemed above it all. Even the air felt dense. Dust motes drifted along shafts of light coming from the high windows, catching the eye like small bits of judgment raining down from above. The quiet wasn't merely ordered by the judge, it was dictated by the seriousness of what was to come. Kody's fingers trembled as he shuffled the papers. He attempted to keep them still, but his fingers betrayed him. He clamped his lips together, mumbling something under his breath. Perhaps it was a prayer, perhaps it was denial, perhaps it was simply a last desperate cry to himself, to get it together. For years, Kody had presented himself as a man in control. He had believed in his power, his dominance, his style of leading his wives and children. But here, in this court of law, his self-made empire wasn't a shield. It was evidence. On the other side of the room sat his estranged wives, Mary, Christine, and Janelle, each separated by bitterness but united in this moment. Their faces told 1,000 stories. Mary's sorrow hardened into resilience. Christine's pain sharpened into courage. Janelle's disappointment cloaked in calm resolve. They had all walked through fire, but they were still standing. And they weren't standing for Kody. They were standing against him. The judge's eyes moved over the courtroom, settling for an instant on Kody. There wasn't pity in the judge's look. It was observation. Judges had observed deception, manipulation, and dysfunctional families 1,000 times. But something was different here. Something that had even the judge sitting forward, poised to unravel the layers of a man who had constructed his life around control. The fingers of the court reporter lay poised on the stenography machine, to record for eternity each word uttered. The arms of the bailiff were crossed, his posture rigid, regarding Kody with the same wariness one uses when facing a trapped animal. And then the noise, the one that pierced the quiet, a faint sniffle. It belonged to Kody himself. Head swiveled, eyes opened wide. This was the man who had stood firm in the face of criticism, who had insisted his approach was correct, who had parried charges of favoritism, abandonment, and treachery. And here he was, his chest shaking as he struggled to hold back the tears that threatened to overflow. Why was Kody Brown crying? The viewers wondered it in silence, their thoughts whirling. Was it guilt? Was it fear? Or was it finally the unbearable burden of all his decisions? The wives he hurt, the children he ignored, the family he shattered. Kody attempted to lift his chin, as though to compose himself. But the illusion was unraveling quicker than he could restore it. His gaze swept the courtroom, and he saw what he dreaded most. Not strangers, not reporters, but his own flesh, his children. They were seated behind their mothers, faces stern, some even avoiding his gaze. He hunted for love in their faces, but saw only disappointment. He hunted for loyalty, but saw only silence. The wall clock ticked, louder with each tick. To Kody, it was like a countdown. A countdown not to a verdict, but to the revelation of all that he had kept hidden for so long. Every lie, every broken promise, every secret, this courtroom was about to bring it all out into the open. The judge cleared his throat. This court will now hear testimony about custody, finances, and family welfare. The words were plain, procedural, but to Kody, they were knives. Custody meant his kids. Finances meant his business. Family welfare meant judgment not only of what he'd done, but of who he was. The audience leaned in more tightly. Camera flashes flashed, capturing the immediacy of the moment. In the crowd, a reporter murmured, "This is history in the making." And she was correct. For the first time, Kody Brown was not the storyteller of his own life. He wasn't in charge. He wasn't the commander. He was just a man on trial, not by law, but by his family, by his history, by what was real. He held the table before him so firmly that his knuckles whitened. His lips shook as he mouthed once more, this time out loud, "They're my family. They can't do this to me." Even as he spoke though, the truth hit home. They weren't his family anymore. They were their own individuals. Individuals who had been crushed by him, and now stood ready to testify against him. The tension was intolerable. Everyone in the courtroom had a sense of what was about to happen. The testimonies would not only unveil facts, wounds, and wounds, when spoken out loud, could ruin a man even more than any verdict ever could. What was it that could make a man like Kody Brown cry? What was it that could bring the once proud head of a polygamous family to a shaking man in a courtroom? The answer wasn't in the papers he held. It wasn't even in the judge's gavel. The answer was waiting in the voices of the people he once called his own. Voices that were about to shatter his image, strip away his pride, and bury him beneath the weight of his own choices. And as the initial witness got ready to testify, Kody's own tears finally escaped, streaming down his face as the world witnessed the start of his demise. The bailiff summoned the first witness, and the courtroom came to a halt. Shoes scuffled against the floor. Reporters rewound cameras, and the crowd leaned forward as Kody Brown approached the stand. Her heels clicked in determined rhythm, a beat that echoed the pounding heartbeat of every single person in the room. Kody had once been Kody's wife, a wife who gave everything to his unusual marriage. But today she wasn't here to support him. Today she was here to accuse him. She rested her hand on the Bible, her voice firm as she vowed to tell the truth. Sitting down, her eyes came briefly to rest on Kody. For an instant, the years of common life flashed in her eyes. Weddings, children, holidays, struggles. But then she hardened. This was not about the life they had shared. This was about the agony that followed. "Your Honor," Kody started, her tone soothing but thick with feeling. "I spent years convincing myself that my sacrifices counted for something, that the emptiness I experienced was somehow a part of the life we had chosen. But the reality is, I gave this man my loyalty, my youth, and my trust. And I was rewarded with nothing but loneliness." Gasps echoed in the courtroom. Mary and Janelle looked at each other, both silently confirming Kody's words. Even the pen of the judge halted for a beat, as if the weight of her words was worth freezing for a moment. Kody went on, each sentence more weighted than the previous one. "I raised our children. I was there for him when the world ridiculed us, when society informed us that our family never could survive. I remained, even when my heart instructed me that I was not visible. And yet, when I needed him most, when our children needed their father, Kody was nowhere to be found. He wasn't leading a family. He was stroking his ego." Kody shifted restlessly in his seat. His hand touched his face, wiping away tears that threatened to fall. His lips quivered as if he wanted to cut in, but his lawyer's firm grip on his arm silenced him. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Brown, can you provide specific examples?" Kody nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Birthdays, graduations, moments that mattered most. My children would gaze toward the doorway, expecting their father to come in, but he didn't. He was too busy pursuing control, or too consumed by favoritism. We lost a husband not only but also lost a father." Here Kody's voice broke. She hesitated, taking a deep breath, and in the flash of a moment the audience caught sight of the raw wound under her strength. Tears flooded her eyes, but she continued. "And what stung the most wasn't his absence. It was knowing when he did return. It was to remind us of his power, not his affection." The courtroom was quiet, except for the soft breathing of Kody. Even the journalists lowered their cameras for a second, understanding they weren't recording scandal. They were witnessing sorrow. And then came the moment that made the courtroom a war zone of emotions. The children were called. The bailiff called out their names. And with each one, they proceeded to the stand. The youngest were apprehensive, glancing nervously at their mothers for support. The older ones approached with stubborn resolve, shoulders set, ready to be heard at last. The first child to speak was hesitant, voice trembling. I used to wait by the window, just to see if Dad would come home early. Sometimes I'd sit there for hours. But he never came. The words pierced the air like glass shattering. Kody closed his eyes, shaking his head slowly, as if trying to erase the memory. His chest rose and fell heavily, his breathing ragged. Another child, older now, stood on the stand. Their voice bore years of repressed pain. When I said to him I was having trouble in school, he said, "Figure it out yourself." But when one of his favorites had trouble, he left everything. I knew then, I wasn't really his child. I was just another burden he didn't want. The courtroom buzzed, a sound of disbelief and compassion. Kody's own tears eventually overflowed, dropping down his cheeks. He struggled to stand up straight, to be strong, but the force of his children's words bent him lower and lower. Then there was the testimony that shattered the silence altogether. Gwen came forward, her face white but her eyes burning. She gazed straight at her father. When she spoke, "Dad, I pleaded for your notice. I needed to know you cared, to know I was important, but you were too engaged in establishing yourself. You weren't my father. You were a stranger." The whole courtroom came to a standstill. No coughs, no shuffles, no whispers, just the pure hurt of a daughter's honesty cutting through the air. Kody's body shook. He lowered his head into his hands, unable to contain the sobs anymore. His shoulders quaked as his tears seeped into the papers on the table before him. The man who was once proud of being in control was now broken by the voices of the very people he said he led. Journalists wrote frantically, taking down every detail. Even they understood, though, that this moment was greater than headlines. This wasn't scandal. It was about the children who had endured too long in silence, finally being given voice. Christine grasped Gwen's hand as she left the stand. It wasn't encouragement. It was victory. For years these mothers and children had been mute under Kody's story. But here in front of the judge, in front of the world, their truth was finally told. And Kody Brown, the man who believed himself invincible, now sat drenched in his own tears. The courtroom air was already heavy with emotion, after Christine's testimony, and the children's tearful testimony, but everyone understood that the real storm was yet to come. The bailiff's voice rang out, firm but weighted. "The court calls Gwen Brown to the stand." The title itself caused murmurs among the group. Gwen had always been considered one of the most vocal of Kody's children, a woman who was not afraid to go up against the man who had referred to himself as their leader. But no one was aware of just how deep her hurt would be, or how biting her words would be. Gwen stood up slowly from her chair. Her footsteps reverberated through the floor, as if the courtroom itself was echoing her strength. She wasn't wearing anything flashy, nothing but a simple blouse and slacks. But her very presence had more clout than any suit or uniform in the courtroom. She hesitated for an instant, took a deep breath, and rested her hand on the Bible. "I promise to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God," she said in a voice strong but shaking just the tiniest bit. As she sat, she caught Kody's eye. He stared back at her with wide, desperate eyes. For an instant father and daughter held each other's eyes. Once, a long time ago, that moment might have been filled with love. But now Gwen's eyes were full of a blend of sadness and steel, and Kody's were full of fear. The attorney instructed her to start. Gwen's opening words cut through the silence. "Dad, I desperately wanted you to see me." The room gasped. No one had anticipated that she would address him directly rather than the court. But Gwen hadn't come today to fulfill protocol. She came to tell her truth. Her voice shook, but she went on. "I recall birthday parties where I blew out candles and wished you would appear. I recall school concerts where I searched the audience for your face. I recall evenings when Mom said you were working late. But I knew the truth. You just didn't want to attend." She swallowed hard, her fists holding tight to the edge of the witness box. Do you know what it feels like to so badly want your father's approval that you begin to believe perhaps if you're smarter, prettier, or quieter, he'll finally care? Do you know what it feels like to understand none of it makes a difference? Because he's already decided who he wants to love. Kody's body shook. His lips parted as if to scream, to deny, to justify. But no sound escaped. His lawyer spoke quietly in his ear, but Kody hardly heard him. His chest rose and fell. His heart pounded and the tears he had struggled to hold back for so long finally escaped. The courtroom was mesmerized. Reporters, viewers, even the bailiff. Everyone was motionless watching the breakdown of a father in front of them. Gwen went on, her voice harder now, more rebellious. You always said you were a leader. You said you were leading this family under God's will. Leaders don't leave their children behind. Leaders don't play favorites. Leaders don't crush the people who look up to them. You weren't my leader, Dad. You weren't even my father. You were a stranger who bore my same last name. The room was once again filled with a collective gasp, this one louder. A number of witnesses covered their mouths in horror. Christine dabbed at tears in her eyes. Mary and Janelle both covered their faces, hurt but justified. Kody emitted a sob that was so audible even the judge was taken aback. He buried his head in his hands, shuddering with uncontrollable body movements. His hair dropped across his forehead, sticky with sweat and tears. The man who had walked with such swagger on national TV was now a shattered figure, brought low by his daughter's voice. The judge leaned forward, his voice stern but kind. Miss Brown, continue. Gwen nodded, taking a deep breath. The thing is, we didn't require perfection. We didn't require power or riches. We simply required a father who loved us, who appeared, who mattered. But what we got was a man who wanted dominance more than he needed intimacy. And that's the reason we're here today, because the truth must be spoken. Her words hung there, heavy as a stone. To Kody, each sentence felt like a hammer to his soul. He had been criticized before, by outsiders, by media, even by his wives. But never had he ever experienced the raw pain of his own child so publicly, so irrefutably. He gripped his chest as if attempting to hold his heart within, but the sobs gave him away. His kingdom of pride, control and denial, was dissolving with every sentence Gwen uttered. By the time she left the stand, the courtroom had been altered. The air was no longer charged with curiosity or scandal, but with reckoning. It wasn't just that people were observing a trial, watching the truth finally catch up to a man who had run from it for too many years. As Gwen went back to her seat, she passed by her father without looking at him. That, and more than anything else, broke him some more. He stretched out his hand somewhat, as if to grasp her hand, but she never turned around. She sat next to Christine, who enveloped her in a silent hug. Kody, on the other hand, slumped against the defense table, his tears being absorbed by the wood as the crowd watched. His lawyer patted his shoulder, but obviously no legal tactic could now spare him. The tide had turned, and all in that courtroom knew it. The trial was no longer concerned with evidence, money, or custody. It was about truth. And the truth had broken Kody Brown. The courtroom was heavy with the silence, so thick that even the slightest rustle of papers sounded like thunder. Kody Brown slumped in his seat, tears streaked across his face, his once confident demeanor shattered. The man who had made his life about power, control, and pride seemed smaller than ever before. His children's words lingered in the air, haunting like a melody he couldn't shake. The judge, a tough woman with years of experience, leaned forward. Her eyes were piercing but tempered with something near humanness, disappointment. She had overseen hundreds of cases, but few times did she ever see a father break down like this under the stress of his own family's suffering. She raised the gavel but didn't bring it down. Instead, she looked at Kody. Mr. Brown, she started off, her tone steady but sharp. This court has witnessed testimony upon testimony, and what I have witnessed here today is not a mere legal case. It is the breakdown of a family, the breakdown of trust, the breakdown of love. Kody gulped hard, his lips quivering as though he was eager to inhale words, but none emerged. The judge went on, her sentences cutting through the hush. Your children have stood here today and informed this court that they felt abandoned. They felt invisible. They cried out for your love, and they were answered with silence, neglect, and rejection. Do you comprehend the severity of what has been spoken here? Kody's head moved slowly in a weak nod. But the judge wasn't satisfied. Answer me, Mr. Brown. Yes, Your Honor, Kody whispered, his voice hoarse and barely audible. The judge continued. This isn't a matter of legal right. This is a matter of the most solemn obligation a man can have. The obligation of being a father. A father is to be a protector, to be a nurturer, to be an unqualified lover, and by your own children's words, you've failed at every one of these obligations. The room was quiet. Mary, Christine, and Janelle sat together, their expressions tense with checked emotion. They weren't gloating over his fall. They were witnessing justice. To the recognition of years of pain. The judge ran her hands through the papers in front of her, then spoke once more. This court has weighed the evidence. But most powerful is the statement of your family. When children stand before this bench and tell us they were abandoned by their father, this court cannot turn a deaf ear. Their voices will not, and cannot be silenced. Kody shattered then, crying out loud. His shoulders trembled and his hands were over his face. For years he had been the dominant one, the leader, the one whose voice everybody else obeyed. But here in this courtroom, the children's voices were louder than any instruction he had ever issued. The judge held him to wait until his sobs ceased before he issued the final blow. Thus, it is the decision of this court that custody, control, and decision-making power will still be in the hands of the mothers, women who remained with their children while you did not. Mr. Brown, you no longer have the control you once asserted. This is not punishment delivered by the court in isolation. It is an indication of the way that you lived, and the price that followed. The words slammed down like a hammer, more massive than the gavel resting in her hand. Kody's wails reduced to frantic gasps. He gripped the table before him, as if clinging to the last shreds of control. But it was lost. Lost not to the system, but to truth. The judge shifted back in her seat, the softening of her tone just enough to cut to his very soul. Mr. Brown, sometimes the worst penalty is not jail or punishment. Sometimes it is having to live with the understanding that you've broken what you were supposed to safeguard. That is your penalty, and it will outlive any judgment this court might make. A ripple ran through the courtroom. Sighs, gasps, even a couple of suppressed sobs from spectators. The gravity of her words was crushing, yet irrefutable. Christine brushed a tear from her cheek. Janelle stood tall, though her lips were shaking. Janelle stood tall, though her lips were shaking. Mary closed her eyes, and remained silent as if offering a prayer in silence. And Gwen sat firm, her hand fisted in her lap, aware that her voice had at last been heard. Kody attempted to stand, but his knees gave. He lowered back into the chair, hiding his face in his hands again. The proud father was no more. What was left was a broken man, broken by the reality of his own shortcomings. The judge raised the gavel at last, her face firm and determined. This case is closed. The crisp slap of the gavel resonated like the last beat of the heart of a dying empire. Kody made a sound halfway between a gasp and a sob, his body trembling so hard that his chair groaned under him. The judge tapped the gavel once, demanding order, but even the loud crack of wood couldn't stifle the storm of emotion that had broken out. Gwen's words hung in the air like smoke after an explosion. Impossible to dispel. Impossible to shut out. His lawyer put a firm grip on his arm, saying something in an urgent whisper. But Kody shook his head furiously, gaze fixed on his daughter. The man who constructed his existence upon control, upon surfaces, upon the notion of being an impenetrable patriarch, was coming apart strand by strand for the world to see. The judge cleared her throat. Miss Brown, state your remarks to the court. But Gwen shook her head gently, respectfully. Your Honor, with all due respect, my truth isn't for the record, it's for him. Because for once in his life, he needs to listen. The courtroom was silent again, as though everyone agreed that rules could bend for this moment. Gwen leaned in, her voice shaking but firm. I don't hate you, Dad. That's the worst part. I wanted to hate you but I couldn't. Because what I did was keep hoping you'd change. Every birthday card you refused to sign. Every holiday you missed. Every time you cared more about someone else's kids. My mom, she included with a growing sob. I thought to myself, maybe next year, Maybe next time. But the truth is, you were never coming. Kody buried his face in his hands, openly crying now. His wide shoulders shuddered. The image was almost too real for some to bear, yet nobody could turn their eyes away. The prosecutor's voice at last shattered the silence. Gwen, can you describe to the court how your father's behavior impacted you personally? Gwen faced the attorney, her jaw clenched, her eyes tearful. It shattered me. I believed love was something you begged for, that I wasn't enough. And when I finally understood I couldn't be the one to win his love, I decided I'd just stop. But then anger arrived. That anger that makes you question God, question your worth, make you not want to ever trust anyone again. That's what he left me with. Not guidance, not protection, just abandonment in the guise of leadership. A whisper spread through the crowd. Brutal empathy, indignation, and grief all nodded together. For the first time, Kody attempted to speak. His voice broke. Gwen, I didn't mean to. But Gwen interrupted him, her voice as cutting as glass. Don't say you didn't mean to do it. Every time you were absent was a choice. Every time you pushed me away was a choice. You chose pride. You chose favorites. And in the process of doing that, you chose to lose me. The words were like a blow from a hammer. Kody cringed, as if the truth itself was a blow. The judge rapped his gavel once more, harder this time. Order, Mr. Brown. You will not speak until told to do so. But Kody hardly heard it. Tears obscured his eyesight, and he puffed and sucked the air with the effort of decades of repression collapsing at once. Gwen's voice grew softer now, no longer harsh, but weighted with sorrow. That was all I ever wanted. A dad, not a leader, not a preacher, not a man on a throne, just a dad. And that is the one thing you never gave me. A sob burst from Mary, who hastily clapped a hand over her mouth. Janelle blotted at tears with shaking hands, hardened by disappointment over the years. Even Christine couldn't stem the torrent of feeling that welled up from her eyes. The prosecutor nodded a gratitude to Gwen and dismissed her from the stand. Stepping down, she did not look at the crowd, the lawyers, or even the judge. Her gaze remained on Kody, blazing with a finality that made him sink further into his chair. The silence thereafter was excruciating. The judge banged the gavel one last time to call for a recess. 10 minutes. Court is adjourned. But the harm was done. The formerly powerful patriarch of the Brown household sat slumped, shattered, and completely isolated. Cameras snapped obsessively. Journalists jotted down notes, aware they had just witnessed the destruction of a man's entire legacy, not through legal definitions or facts, but through the absolute force of truth uttered by his own offspring. And in that instant, the whole room knew. Kody Brown wasn't crying because of the legislation. He wasn't crying because of the judgment that awaited. He was crying because finally he saw himself not as the leader he had pretended to be, but as the father he had failed.